The year was 73 CE, deep in the reign of Emperor Vespasian, when the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power. Across vast provinces stretching from Britannia to Judea, millions lived under Roman rule. Among them were enslaved women whose lives were governed not by hope, but by the iron laws of one of the most disciplined and unforgiving societies on earth. On a cold morning in early March, near the bustling port city of Ostia, a group of chained women were marched into a forum filled with merchants, soldiers, and magistrates. Their crime was simple yet unforgivable in the eyes of Rome. They had tried to run, and in Rome, escape was not just defiance but a direct insult to the power of the master and the authority of the state. The punishments that awaited them reflected a world built on hierarchy, brutality, and absolute control. To understand the fate of these women, one must first grasp the nature of Roman slavery itself. Unlike later forms of slavery, Roman enslavement did not target any single race. Anyone could become a slave. Conquered peoples, abandoned infants, debtors, and even unfortunate travelers kidnapped by pirates were dragged into servitude. In the early 1st century CE, scholars estimate that nearly 1/3 of Rome's population consisted of slaves. In cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Carthage, enslaved women performed countless roles. Some were domestic servants, tending to elite Roman households. Others labored in textile workshops, kitchens, vineyards, or massive rural estates. Some were forced into prostitution or brothels licensed by the state. Their legal status was brutally simple. They were property, completely under the dominion of their masters. They could not legally marry, testify against a free person, or defend themselves in court. If they displeased their owners, the consequences could be immediate and devastating. Yet despite these harsh realities, escape attempts were far more common than ancient writers admitted. Evidence from Roman legal texts, graffiti, runaway advertisements, and archaeological finds reveal that enslaved women often risked their lives for the faintest chance at freedom. Some fled with the help of sympathetic workers or soldiers. Others fled toward the countryside, believing they could vanish among villages or mountain communities. Some tried to blend into crowded cities, altering their hairstyles or clothing to pass as freedwomen. But Rome had built an entire system to prevent such escapes. Patrols known as stations hunted runaways. Professional slave catchers roamed major roads, ports, and markets. Inns and taverns were required by law to check the papers of suspicious travelers. And perhaps most feared of all were the branding irons used to mark recaptured slaves. For enslaved women, the fear of punishment was especially severe. Roman society was deeply patriarchal, and female slaves were often viewed as doubly inferior, both as slaves and as women. If a woman ran away, Roman law considered it a challenge to male authority. This made her punishment harsher than that given to many men. The jurist Ulpian, writing in the 3rd century, noted that female fugitives were often beaten more severely to deter others from attempts of escape. Their bodies, in the eyes of the Roman elite, symbolized ownership. So when a woman fled, the state saw it as a dangerous disruption of social order. In the case of the women captured near Ostia, the details were recorded in fragments of municipal documents discovered centuries later. They had belonged to a wealthy merchant family engaged in shipping grain from Egypt. A sack of wheat missing could be replaced, but a missing slave in the Roman world, meant the loss of property and a personal humiliation for the master. It threatened the stability of households and business operations. Masters responded to such attempts with harsh discipline, not simply out of cruelty, but as a warning to others within their estates. The Roman economy relied heavily on forced labor. If slaves believed they could escape without consequence, the system itself would weaken. Therefore, punishments for runaway slaves were designed with two goals: to inflict pain and to broadcast a message. Roman punishment rituals often took place in public spaces where humiliation was part of the sentence. The women in Ostia were forced to sit before a tribunal of lower magistrates who served under the authority of the praetor. They were not allowed to speak in their defense. Under Roman law, their testimony had no validity unless extracted under torture. Their masters stood beside the court, presenting evidence of their escape attempt. With cold efficiency, the magistrate ordered that they be subjected to flagellation. The lictors, the officials responsible for implementing corporal punishment, brought out their bundles of rods. Witnesses wrote of the quiet murmurs passing through the watching crowd. The women were positioned in the center of the forum, their hands tied to wooden posts, ensuring that the spectacle unfolded in full view of the public. But this was only the beginning. For habitual runaways, Roman law allowed branding. An iron stamp heated in a brazier could be pressed onto the forehead, marking the enslaved person permanently. The letters stood for the Latin phrase fugitivus, meaning fugitive. Such branding served both as punishment and identification. A slave marked in this way could never claim to be free. In large cities, it allowed slave catchers to quickly identify recaptured individuals. But the branding carried another weight, a social stigma that followed the woman throughout her life. It was a declaration to all who saw her that she had once attempted to defy Rome's order and had failed. Another punishment frequently used for female slaves was forced labor in mines or quarries. These places were brutal even by Roman standards. Women subjected to this sentence rarely survived long. The air in the mines was thick with dust. The darkness was suffocating. Guards patrolled with whips. Food was scarce. For many, this punishment was a death sentence disguised as labor. The Roman writer Diodorus Siculus described the mines of Egypt as places where hope itself could not survive. Yet Rome used them often, especially for women who had repeatedly tried to escape or committed acts considered rebellious. The punishments for runaway women were embedded within larger political realities. Rome was constantly expanding, conquering new territories. Each victory brought more enslaved people into the empire. This created fear among the elite that revolt could erupt at any moment. The memory of the servile wars, especially Spartacus's massive rebellion in 73 BC, lingered in Roman consciousness. Although Spartacus's rebellion had been led largely by men, the Romans believed that leniency toward any slave, male or female, could lead to greater unrest. Applying strict punishments to female fugitives signaled strength and discipline. It was a way of showing that the empire would not tolerate even the smallest act of rebellion. Yet, for all its brutality, the Roman system of punishment reveals something deeper. It shows how enslaved women resisted oppression in ways often lost to history. Though many accounts were written by Roman men who saw slaves as property, the evidence of escape attempts demonstrates the courage of women who risked everything for freedom. Their stories were not preserved in marble monuments or grand histories. They were recorded in legal texts, graffiti, and court fragments. Through these small windows into the past, we see women determined to reclaim their lives even when the cost was severe. Their struggle against bondage, though often crushed by violence, left a lasting mark on the moral conscience of the world. The year was 119 C, deep in the reign of Emperor Hadrian, when the cold winds of northern Britain swept across the rugged frontier. Roman occupation stretched from the prosperous towns of Londinium and Camuloginum to the heavily fortified military zones, edging the territory of the Brigantes and Votadini tribes. It was in this harsh environment, far from the marble columns of Rome, that enslaved women faced some of the most brutal punishments in the empire. Here the rules of civilization blurred with the reality of frontier warfare. And when enslaved women attempted to flee, the consequences were often far more violent than anything recorded in the imperial heartlands. In the garrisoned town of Eboracum, modern York, Roman soldiers, merchants, craftsmen, and enslaved people lived in a tense but structured coexistence. Enslaved women worked in kitchens, bathhouses, textile shops, and officer residences. Many came from conquered tribes, captured during campaigns in northern Europe. Unlike the Greek or Syrian slaves who were often purchased for their skills, the enslaved women from northern tribes were usually treated as spoils of war. They were forced into heavy labor, punished quickly for disobedience, and closely watched for any sign of resistance. In early autumn of 119 CE, a group of 3 enslaved women disappeared from a Roman villa estate located just outside the town. Their names were recorded only partially in a damaged wooden tablet discovered centuries later: Alia, Brena, and Una. Alia was believed to be a native of Germania, likely captured during Trajan's campaigns along the Rhine. Brena and Una were Britons from the Brigantes tribe, taken after a local uprising had been crushed by Roman auxiliaries. All 3 women worked under the authority of a Roman land overseer named Livius Varro, a man known for his harsh discipline and rigid enforcement of imperial law. The 3 women had fled under cover of darkness, using knowledge of nearby forests and marshlands. Their plan was to travel north toward the tribal territories beyond Roman control. But unknown to them, the Romans had recently established a system of frontier patrols to prevent such escapes. Within 2 days, they were found by a unit of auxiliary soldiers, cold, exhausted, and hiding near a stream north of Isurium. The soldiers transported them back to the estate in iron shackles. Their capture was expected, but their punishment would become a chilling example widely discussed in frontier communities. Roman Britain was not governed with the same patience or legal formalities seen in Italy. Here, military authority often overshadowed civil courts. A runaway slave was not just a legal matter. It was a threat to Roman stability in a region already prone to rebellion. Women like Brena and Una belonged to the very people Rome feared might rise again. Punishing them publicly served a double purpose. It discouraged slaves across Britain from attempting escape, and it projected Roman might in front of native populations still uncertain of Rome's strength. Upon their return, Livius Varro brought the women before a rural tribunal known as a conventus. Unlike the orderly courts of Rome, these hearings were often brief. The overseer presented his accusations, describing the women as defiant, disobedient, and dangerous. Alia was singled out as the ringleader, though the evidence was thin. The magistrate, accompanied by 2 centurions, did not inquire into their treatment or reasons for fleeing. In Roman law, their motives were irrelevant. Their bodies were property, and property had attempted to escape. The punishment issued by the magistrate was severe even by Roman frontier standards. Because the escape might inspire others, and because 2 of the women belonged to a recently subdued tribe, the tribunal ordered that all 3 be subjected to public corporal punishment, followed by forced labor in a military work camp. But the cruelty did not stop there. The magistrate allowed the overseer himself to determine the method of display, giving him freedom to use the sentence as a public example. The following morning, the women were taken to the center of Eboracum, near the marketplace, where soldiers, merchants, and townspeople gathered. The cold air carried the metallic scent of the tools prepared for the punishment. Roman soldiers erected a wooden platform, ensuring the spectacle would be visible from every angle. Public punishment in Roman Britain was not merely a sentence. It was a ritual of control. The watching crowd played as important a role as the women being punished. Alia, Brena, and Una were forced onto the platform, each with their hands tied behind them. Their clothes were torn to expose their backs, not out of humiliation alone, but to ensure the lashes struck flesh directly. The first step of the punishment was scourging. Unlike the flagellation done in Rome with bundles of thin birch rods, frontier punishments used heavier whips with leather thongs reinforced by pieces of bone or bronze. Each stroke tore open the skin more violently, serving as both punishment and spectacle. Alia received the first blows. Witnesses described her struggling to remain upright as the lash cut into her back. Brena and Una followed, each crying out as they endured the punishment. The crowd watched, some indifferent, some quietly horrified, but none daring to intervene. Roman discipline was not a matter for debate. It was a symbol of the empire's authority. After the scourging, the magistrate ordered the second part of the sentence. The women were marched through the streets of the town in chains, paraded before soldiers and citizens. A wooden placard hung around each woman's neck, inscribed with the Latin words fugitiva mulier, meaning fugitive woman. Parading runaway slaves was a common Roman practice, intended to deepen the humiliation and reinforce the idea that slaves were property whose rebellion could never succeed. But the worst part of their fate was yet to come. The women were assigned to forced labor in a military work camp located near the construction site of a new fortification along the frontier. These camps were notorious for their deadly conditions. Women were rarely sent to such places unless authorities wished to break them completely or ensure they never attempted escape again. The camps demanded relentless physical labor. The enslaved women carried heavy stones, dug trenches in freezing weather, prepared raw timber, and hauled equipment for the soldiers. They slept in cramped wooden sheds with little protection from the cold. Many prisoners sent to such camps died within months from exhaustion, disease, or exposure. For Brena and Una, the conditions were particularly traumatic. Working in a military environment meant constant surveillance by armed men. Punishment for slowing down or collapsing was immediate, usually a blow from a soldier's staff or whip. Alia, older and weakened by years of labor, struggled most. She collapsed repeatedly, her body not recovering from the earlier scourging. Within weeks she died from a combination of infection and exhaustion. Her body, unceremoniously buried outside the camp, was recorded in a small wax tablet found centuries later. Yet despite the brutality, the story of these women reveals a deeper truth about Roman rule in Britain. Their escape, though unsuccessful, symbolized the growing resistance of conquered peoples. Female slaves were not passive victims. They acted with courage in the face of overwhelming power. Their attempts weakened Roman confidence and reminded the empire that domination required constant force. For every Brena and Una captured, there were others who vanished into forests or tribal lands beyond Rome's control. Some were never found. Their disappearance troubled Roman officials for decades. By the 2nd century CE, repeated escape attempts from enslaved women in frontier provinces forced Rome to strengthen its security systems, expand patrols, and increase legal punishments. The brutality inflicted upon these women played a direct role in shaping Roman policies. Their suffering became a tool used by authorities to frighten others, but their resistance left a lasting mark on the empire's historical record. They demonstrated that even under severe oppression, the desire for freedom could not be extinguished. In the heart of the Roman Empire, where marble temples shone under the Mediterranean sun and senators debated beneath towering columns, life for enslaved women followed a very different rhythm. Rome in the 2nd century CE was the capital of the world, a city of wealth, power, and astonishing cultural achievement. Yet beneath that dazzling surface lay a harsh social order built on strict discipline and absolute domination. When enslaved women attempted to escape, especially within the capital, their punishments were not only violent but symbolic. Rome wanted the world to see that even in its most refined spaces, rebellion would be crushed without mercy. It was the year 142 CE when a runaway case shocked the city. A woman named Livia, a Greek, born slave, had escaped from a distinguished senatorial household near the Circus Maximus. Her story survives in fragments of the Jurist Gaius and in records from the city prefect's office. Livia had been educated, intelligent, and trained as a household scribe. Such slaves were valuable, often treated better than laborers but still remained property. The more useful the slave, the harsher the punishment for escape, because the loss was greater. Livia's owner, Senator Sextus Aemilianus, was enraged not only because she fled, but because she fled from the heart of elite Roman society. What made Livia's case even more serious was her attempt to disguise herself as a freedwoman. Roman freedwomen were common in the city. They ran shops, lived modest lives, and sometimes became wealthy. By cutting her hair and borrowing garments from another servant, Livia attempted to pass as one of them. This act alone was viewed as an insult to Roman order. Identity in Rome was everything. Clothing, hairstyles, and markings communicated one's place in society. If a slave managed to pass as free, it disrupted the entire hierarchy that held the empire together. When Livia was captured, the reaction was swift. She was brought before the office of the urban prefect, the powerful official charged with maintaining order in the capital. The courtroom was located near the Roman Forum, surrounded by statues of emperors and victorious generals. But this was no place of mercy. The prefect viewed her escape as a direct challenge to the authority of elite Roman families. The fact that she had disguised herself only aggravated the offense. One of the most feared punishments in Rome for female runaways was interrogation under controlled torment. Roman law allowed officials to extract information through pain, believing it revealed truth. Livia was forced to reveal whether she had accomplices, whether anyone in the household had helped her, and whether she planned her escape alone. Though records do not describe every detail, Roman writers made clear that questioning enslaved women was far more severe than men, because women were considered more likely to be influenced by emotion or fear. After interrogation, the urban prefect delivered a sentence designed not only to punish Livia, but to warn others in the city. She would be paraded through the Forum, branded, and assigned to the Ergastulum, an underground labor prison known for its brutality. Ergastula existed on farms and estates across Italy, but Rome's city, Ergastula, were infamous. These were underground chambers where slaves were chained, forced to work in darkness, and kept under constant surveillance. Many did not survive long. The public branding of runaway women in Rome followed a strict ritual. Livia was taken to the steps of the temple of Castor and Pollux, one of the most visible public spaces. A crowd gathered, as they always did for such events. Vendors sold food, children perched on columns, and citizens crowded forward to watch. For Rome, punishment was a public act, a demonstration of power. Livia was forced to kneel as a heated iron rod was prepared. The symbol burned into her forehead marked her permanently. It did not simply identify her as a fugitive. It declared to everyone who saw her that she had once challenged the authority of her master and of Rome. After the branding, she was sold directly from the city's slave market at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. This was another form of humiliation. Being sold in a public auction meant that her previous status as a literate household slave was erased. She was now categorized as a disciplinary slave, a person assigned to heavy labor with little chance of manumission. The change was dramatic. Rome's slave market was noisy and chaotic. Auctioneers shouted prices. Buyers inspected bodies as if examining livestock. Many slaves were displayed on platforms with signs indicating their age, skills, and origin. For runaway women, the sign often included the word fugitiva, reducing them forever to a category of people considered untrustworthy. Livia was purchased by a wealthy landowner who operated an ergastulum on his estate outside the city. This underground prison was a place of relentless discipline. Slaves were kept in chains, forced to sleep in cramped conditions, and assigned to stone cutting, quarry work, or grain milling for endless hours. Ergastula were designed to crush the will of those sent there. Some enslaved women survived for years, while others died from exhaustion, infection, or the brutality of guards. Livia's fate remained unknown in the surviving records, but her story reflected a broader truth. In Rome, escape was not simply a crime, it was a threat to the social fabric. Punishment needed to be terrifying enough to deter others. The brutal treatment of runaway women in Rome was not limited to hard labor and branding. Another common punishment was the collar. These iron collars were locked around the neck of recaptured women, often inscribed with messages such as "Hold me, so I do not run, or I am the property of my master." They served multiple purposes. They prevented the slave from blending into the population. They publicly humiliated the wearer, and they acted as a physical reminder that any attempt to remove the collar would be punished with death. Archaeologists have discovered several such collars across Italy. Most belong to women. The language carved into them reveals the attitudes of the time. Owners wanted not only to keep their slaves controlled, but to ensure that anyone meeting them understood their status. A woman wearing such a collar had no way to hide. Even free citizens who sympathized with her situation were legally required to return her to her master. One of the darkest aspects of Roman punishment was sexual exploitation. While some punishments were formally recorded, others were understood but not written in official law. Enslaved women who attempted escape were considered dangerous, rebellious, and in need of discipline. Owners believed that humiliating a woman physically or sexually reinforced dominance. Ancient sources hint at this reality without stating it openly. Household accounts show sudden pregnancies among captured runaways. Letters from Roman soldiers mention discipline of female prisoners. Roman law did not protect enslaved women from sexual violence. Punishment became another way to enforce the hierarchy. This harsh system shaped Roman society in profound ways. The continual need to punish runaways revealed a weakness in the empire. Despite Rome's power, its economy relied heavily on the forced labor of people who did not wish to be there. Women, in particular, resisted in ways the legal system feared. They ran hid, forged documents, or sought refuge in temples. Their repeated escape attempts forced Rome to reinforce its laws, creating an increasingly brutal network of punishments designed to maintain control. Yet these punishments also preserved the memory of resistance. Every runaway case recorded, every branding iron discovered, every engraved collar found in archaeological digs tells a story. These objects are silent witnesses to the courage of women who chose agony over slavery. They reveal a side of Roman history often hidden behind tales of emperors, senators, and military victories. They show that enslaved women were not passive. They fought for freedom even when the empire crushed them again and again. By the late 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire stretched deep into North Africa, controlling territories across modern Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and parts of Morocco. These lands, once ruled by Carthaginian elites and Berber kingdoms, had become a vital part of Rome's economy. North Africa supplied the empire with grain, olive oil, and livestock, feeding millions of citizens across the Mediterranean. But behind the agricultural wealth lay a workforce of enslaved men and women whose lives were defined by extreme labor, strict supervision, and brutal discipline. It was here, in the fertile plains of Africa Proconsularis, that one of the most terrifying examples of Roman punishment for escaped enslaved women unfolded. Unlike the urban cases in Rome or the frontier stories of Britain, North Africa combined two harsh forces: military oversight and agricultural exploitation. The estates of wealthy Roman landowners, known as latifundia, stretched for miles. Hundreds of enslaved workers labored under the sun, many of them women who planted, harvested, and processed grain that would eventually reach the city of Rome itself. In the year 198 C, during the reign of Emperor Septimius Severus, a group of enslaved women fled from a vast estate near the city of Thysdrus, a wealthy settlement famous for its amphitheater and agricultural output. Their escape was daring. Records found in a damaged inscription describe 5 women: Sabina, Tullia, Marcia, Leontia, and Ibis. Each came from different regions. Some were native North Africans captured during earlier rebellions, while others were brought from Syria or Greece. Despite their diverse origins, they shared one fate: They were bound to labor on a plantation controlled by one of the most powerful families in the province. The overseer of the estate, a Roman named Gaius Ferox, ran the farm with military precision. Ferox believed that enslaved workers could only be controlled through fear. Reports found in writing tablets suggest he imposed daily quotas, enforced silence during work, and appointed informants among the slaves. The fact that 5 women escaped together was seen as a direct failure of his authority. They fled at dusk, using the tall olive groves as cover. Their idea was to travel toward the mountains where local Berber communities often resisted Roman rule. These tribes sometimes offered refuge to escaped slaves, though doing so was dangerous. Rome punished any community that sheltered runaways. Even so, the mountains represented freedom in a way no settlement under Roman control could. The women traveled through fields and dry creeks for 2 days, but their absence was quickly discovered. Ferox dispatched a group of slave catchers who worked closely with Roman soldiers stationed nearby. Unlike Italy, North Africa had constant movement of troops, watching for rebellions. Soldiers on horseback combed the countryside. Once footprints and disturbed vegetation were found, the pursuit tightened. The women were captured near a rocky hill where they had attempted to hide in a small cave. Weakened by exhaustion and fear, they could not fight back. They were brought back to the estate, and here the real brutality began. Gaius Ferox wanted an example so severe that no one on his plantation would dare attempt escape again. He invoked a rarely used but perfectly legal Roman punishment known as damnatio ad bestias, public execution by animals. Though this sentence was more commonly imposed for serious crimes or rebellious slaves, Ferox claimed the women's escape endangered the estate and therefore qualified as treason against Roman order. His request was approved by local authorities. What followed became one of the most chilling and symbolic acts of punishment recorded in Roman Africa. A public festival was planned at the amphitheater of Thystris. These amphitheaters were not only for entertainment, but acted as arenas where Rome displayed its power. Citizens gathered in thousands, traders sold food, musicians played, and Roman officials toured the area proudly. Into this crowd, the 5 captured women were brought in chains. Their sentence was announced to the public as a warning. The message was clear. Anyone who challenged Roman authority, even an enslaved woman, would face the wrath of the empire. Before their execution, the women were paraded around the arena floor. This humiliation was part of the ritual. Slaves condemned to death were meant to be seen, judged, and mocked. The spectacle reminded the crowd of Rome's strength. It also reminded every enslaved person in attendance that their lives were controlled entirely by their masters and the state. While damnatio ad bestias was often used for men, women were not exempt. Roman writings contain brief references to such punishments, especially during periods of political instability. The animals used varied from province to province. In North Africa, where wild beasts were common, leopards and hyenas were often kept in cages beneath the arena. Their appearance before the crowd provoked shock and fear. On the day of the execution, multiple animals were released. Sabina and Marcia were killed quickly, but the deaths of the others were slow and horrifying. The crowd cheered, some out of fear, others out of excitement. This event became infamous not because it was unique, but because it highlighted a reality often ignored in polished Roman histories. The empire's order depended on terror. Punishments like these were not random acts of cruelty. They were part of a system designed to maintain control over millions of enslaved people, many of whom were women forced into labor, domestic service, or exploitation. The deaths of Sabina, Tullia, Marcia, Leontia, and Ibis were a message as loud as any decree issued by a Roman emperor. Yet the empire's brutality also contained the seeds of future resistance. News of their execution spread among rural communities. Some Berber groups, already hostile to Roman rule, increased their raids on plantations. Local rebellions against taxation and forced labor intensified in later decades. The more Rome punished runaway women publicly, the more it revealed its dependence on violence to maintain authority. These executions were meant to inspire fear, but they also inspired quiet acts of defiance. Enslaved women continued to run away, hide, sabotage tools, and resist in whatever ways they could. By the 3rd century CE, the empire's control over North Africa weakened. Economic troubles, political instability, and external invasions strained the system. Large estates began to collapse. When they did, many enslaved women took advantage of the chaos. Some fled into the mountains. Others blended into local communities. Some found protection from tribes Rome could never fully conquer. Rome's punishments could break bodies, but they could not crush hope. The stories of runaway enslaved women across the empire reveal the darker side of Roman civilization. Behind the temples, roads, and armies was a world where millions lived under constant threat. For women, the risks were even greater. Their bodies were controlled, their identities erased, and their attempts at freedom punished with unimaginable violence. But their courage shaped history. Their resistance forced Rome to tighten laws, strengthen patrols, and continuously reinforce its system of domination. And even though many did not survive, their defiance remains a powerful reminder that the human spirit fights for freedom, even in the face of an empire.